of the Rotary Club of Toronto, Eglinton, on November the 17th, a great day in history. This was the day in 1558 when Queen Elizabeth I ascended the throne. In 1839, Verdi's opera, Alberti Conde Di, was produced and premiered for the first time. In 1855, David Livingstone was the first European to see the Victoria Falls. Coincidentally, on this day in 1869 and 1913, the Suez Canal opened, and the same day in 1913, the first ship sailed through the Panama Canal. In 1928, for you sports lovers, Notre Dame finally loses a football game after 23 years. 1938, a Canadian note, Gordon Lightfoot. He sang the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald for the first time. And on that pleasant historical note, let us now go to the reflection. And John, I believe you're going to perform for us.
I am, and you took all the great things out of what happened today right from my list, but I'll stop that. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Rotary, which we haven't done in a while. I'm going to go through the objective of Rotary and the four-way test, which we haven't repeated. We might do that to remind ourselves every once in a while that we're following it. The objective of Rotary is to encourage and foster the ideal service as a basis of worthy enterprise, and in particular to encourage and foster, first, better development of acquaintance of an opportunity for service. Second, high ethical standards in business and professions. Third, the application of ideal service to in each Rotarian's personal, business, and community life. Fourth, advancement of international understanding, goodwill, peace through world fellowship of business and professional persons united in the idea.
Hello.
Can you hear me? Whoever that was?
Yeah.
Okay, in the four-way test, I'm just going to repeat it again so we all remember this. It is a non-sectarian ethical guide for Rotarians to use in their personal and professional relationships. The test has been translated into more than 100 languages, and Rotarians often cite it at club meetings, and I don't think we've done it for a while. But here we go. Number one, is it the truth? Number two, is it fair to all concerned? Number three, will it build goodwill and better friendships? And number four, will it be beneficial to all concerned? And that's all I have for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And we have some guests with us today. Megan will be speaking to us later and will be more formally introduced. But we have a guest I see by the name of Bukola. Bukola, I know you're muted, but could you introduce yourself briefly? Or is somebody else introducing Bukola?
Bukola is from my Environmental Action Committee at the district. So she is poking in, but feel free to chime in, Bukola.
Hello, hi. My name is Bukola, and yes, as Nylan mentioned, I am a member of the Environmental Action Committee with the district. I'm also a member of the Rotaract Club of Toronto, and I'm the director of the Environmental Action Committee in my club. I'm really excited to join this meeting today.
Wonderful, love to have you with us. And I see Abina. Abina, are you now a regular attender at our meetings?
Yes, well, this is my third meeting. And I know Lois said we are supposed to connect, discuss, becoming a member of the club, but so far I'm enjoying it.
Wonderful.
Abina, could you tilt your camera a little bit so that it centers you? Abina, tilt your camera so that you're centered. Oh, the other way. I want to see your chin. Beautiful.
Yep.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. Do we have any other visitors or guests? Okay. Birthdays. Very, very significant birthday today. Without this birthday, we probably wouldn't even have a president of the club. Mike Moy, congratulations. November the 20th.
Thank you, Ron.
We should probably all sing, "Why was he born so beautiful? Why was he born at all?" But we'll save that for another occasion.
Let's not.
And now the important highlight of the meeting, the speaker. Neelam, I believe you're introducing a speaker.
Thank you, Ron. Well, I'm really pleased to introduce Megan McLean. She is not a total stranger to our club. She has been here before, but we've had a number of new members, and the issue of the environment and climate change is also evolving. Now, the city of Toronto is actually probably one of the foremost cities, not in Canada, but around the world. It is the fastest growing city in North America. And Ron's firm, A.T. Kearney itself, issues a global cities outlook. And on that one, it ranked first recently. And it's a huge task as we grow. And the issue of climate change is the responsibility of everyone. And Megan will be speaking about, what the city of Toronto is doing. And she is a project lead for the Environment Energy Division there. And in this role, she is responsible for community engagement strategies, not only for climate change, but for other environmental initiatives, and developing and supporting partnerships, projects, and opportunities that aim to reach our greenhouse gas reductions targets. She has also worked on cities' delivery of community outreach programs, public engagement, consultation, capacity building, and she has a Master of Science from the University of Guelph and a diploma in public administration from Western University. And given that Rotary has recently adopted the environment as a seventh area of focus, I am sure her presentation will be useful, not only learning about how our city is tackling this issue, but also opportunities for us to get engaged. So with that, I hand over the mic to Megan.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Neelam. Thanks for having me. And yes, I am not a stranger of this club. I have been to this club in person, I think 3 times, and not just in my role at the City of Toronto, but also in my previous role when I was involved with a Rotary-based not-for-profit. So I am a big fan of this club. So thank you again for having me. I'm just going to share my screen here. Here we go. Awesome. Sorry, let me just get organized here so I can actually see some people. Note that I won't be able to see everyone. I can only see about 8 people right now. So if you have any questions or anything, feel free to unmute yourself or pop it in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as well. But yes, again, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to quite briefly talk on some pretty big topics today, talking about the city's climate action strategy, climate change in Toronto, and some opportunities of involvement, as Neelam has mentioned. I say the word brief because climate is a huge topic, as I'm sure you can imagine. So I'm going to go quite quickly through some things. So if you've heard me speak before, I also talk really fast. So please just let me know if I'm going too quickly through things. If you have any questions, just interrupt me. I'm pretty chill. So just let me know whatever it is you need to learn something from this presentation or not. Again, I know that I have been here before talking about very similar topics, so I apologize for any overlap from last time that I attended your club. There is a couple updates, and I will talk about those as we go through. Okie dokie. So that's me. Let's talk about climate change in Toronto. So I'm sure everyone who lives in Toronto can imagine the climate impacts already. I'm sure you've seen in your neighborhood or where you work or throughout when you're going around the city, you've seen the impacts of climate change. This, you can see on your screen, is an example of a climate event. This is actually back in 2017. You might remember when the islands flooded quite significantly in May of 2017. This was caused by a combination of heavy rains and record runoff on the lake. And there was an unusually warm winter that year that actually raised Lake Ontario a meter above its normal levels, the highest it had been in 100 years. So again, if you're familiar with Toronto, which I'm assuming you all are, you'll know that the island has flooded again significantly since May 2017. But this was really a big event for some folks who hadn't really seen climate impacts in the past, because it really was quite devastating for the residents of the island, and then also in terms of tourism and many Torontonians that like to enjoy the island throughout the spring and summer months. So if you heard me speak before, you've already seen this slide, but this is just a little snapshot of what our weather might look like in Toronto. Not to confuse the terms between weather and climate, but this is what Toronto might look like by 2050, should we not do anything. So we'll see hotter, wetter, wilder weather, hotter days, extended heat waves, so on and so forth. And a lot of these things we're seeing already. If you were in Toronto over the summer, we did have some fairly hot and extended heat waves. I don't show this to frighten anyone, although the information is of course concerning, but I just want to assure you that there is a lot happening in Toronto and worldwide for climate. So while this is a projection, like a modeling of what it might look like in Toronto, this is as if we were doing nothing. And that is not the case, which I will chat about in a second. So we know climate change is happening. We know what the impact on our city is. We also know why climate change is happening. I don't think this will be news to anyone. It's due to the emissions in greenhouse gas emissions in our environment. And in Toronto, we have three big sources of emissions. So how we heat, cool, and power our buildings, that's the green chunk there on your screen. How we get around the city, so our transportation, that's the blue chunk there. And then our waste, so what we're throwing into the trash that ends up in landfills. And you can see here a further breakdown of the greenhouse gas emissions by source on your bottom right-hand corner. Again, I don't need to go into any of this, but just to be mindful of climate in Toronto is really associated with these three big buckets of our buildings, our transportation, and our waste. So just a little further breakdown. I like to go into this a little bit more in detail so folks can see where they might land in terms of contributing to emissions, because often it's very challenging to think about where we, like what role we're playing in terms of emissions. We don't really see it per se. Like you might think about like tailpipe emissions from your car when you see like some horrible smelling and dark like gases coming from your tailpipe. Sure, yes, you can see that, but it's often very hard for folks to get their head around what role they play in the emissions in Toronto. So you can see here about half of our emissions associated with buildings is actually our own homes. So whether you live in a single family home or an apartment or a condo, the emissions associated with your home are captured into this number, and it's about half. The bigger number for residents of Toronto is our transportation. So almost like 75% of our emissions are our own vehicles, like how we get around the city. And then finally, in terms of our waste, as I mentioned, like a big chunk of that is our landfill. So that's our 98% of our emissions are associated with landfills. The city has a number of closed landfills and only one active landfill. And the measurement of those closed landfills is where we get, and our active landfill is where we get these figures from. And a big proportion of the emissions associated with landfill is actually our food waste. So be mindful if you're thinking about maybe a climate action project in your community, that food waste might be one that might be something you might be interested in tackling. So just to switch gears for a second and talk about how people feel about climate change. So this is equally important to us at the city and understanding where our emissions come from, but we also need to understand what people understand about climate. And we're actually, this survey that you can see the results of on your screen here, it's actually from 2018, and it is currently open for an update from 2021. So we will soon see in the next couple of weeks some results of how people's perceptions or attitudes might have shifted over the last 3 years, understanding that of course we're in the midst still of a pandemic. So trying to understand where people's concerns lie as associated to other daily concerns or other long-term concerns. But really what we're seeing in Toronto is that overall people are pretty concerned about climate change, and overall like over 90% of people think that they themselves and others do need to make a change to reduce their emissions. But the big number is the scary one at the bottom for us, is that 48% of folks in Toronto state that they don't know what to do for climate change. So that's a big number for us. That's like half of Torontonians are concerned about climate change but don't know what to do. So you can understand there, you can see quite easily, you can make the connection between how this might cause some serious mental health concerns for folks, in that if there's something you're very worried about and you don't know what to do, like that can cause a lot of issues. So well, that is a concerning number, the 48%. That's our target. That's where we want to get. We want to get that number down. We want to get people active and understanding about climate and get them in their communities, taking on projects and really contributing to climate mitigation, but then also improving their livelihood, their neighborhoods, the city as a whole. So as I mentioned, we do have a strategy of the City of Toronto. It's called Transform TO. It was unanimously adopted in 2017. And if you are a municipal political nerd like me, you'll understand that unanimous is very exciting for a strategy of this magnitude. But really, Transform TO is called that because it really requires some transformative changes in our city and how we live, work, play, get around, all these things in our city. And it's really long term. So the original strategy from 2017 laid out long-term goals to 2050, which is quite long term for a municipal policy. But what's cool about the strategy is that it has all these guiding principles, in that when we talk about climate action, we're talking about improving our city in other ways. So contributing to poverty reduction, enhancing our local economy, improving affordability, creating resiliency in our city. So while we want to mitigate climate change, we want to ensure that our city is also ready for the impacts of climate change and extreme weather. So when we talk about climate change in Toronto and climate action, we talk about things that do both. So things that reduce those emissions in those buckets of homes and buildings, transportation and waste, but also improve the equity, prosperity, and health of our city and our residents. So I'm just like, I like to flag this for folks because I think it makes the climate argument, if I can use that term like very lightly, a little bit easier, in that you really can, if you were thinking about a climate action project, you can really meet people where they're at in terms of what their priorities might be, what they're interested in working on, what issues their neighborhood or community might be facing, and to frame it with a climate lens. So really, that's a lot of my work, is meeting with communities to talk about what a neighborhood priority might be and how we can make that project into something that reduces those harmful emissions, but also improves the community and addresses those priorities in another way. So I just flagged that's a unique thing to Toronto. There are other jurisdictions that talk about climate action in this way, but Toronto is a leader in terms of talking about climate action in this format. So as I mentioned, Transform TO has a number of long-term goals. You can see them here on your screen, and I don't need to go into them because they're kind of boring and they don't necessarily relate to everyone. But you can see here again those 3 buckets of emissions really reflected. So how we're going to reduce emissions associated with our buildings, our new construction, and with retrofitting our older buildings. Our current buildings, rather, I shouldn't say older buildings, current buildings, how we're going to reduce emissions with waste, so encouraging active transportation, encouraging uptake of electric vehicles, and waste, so moving towards a more circular economy and a zero waste, so zero waste to landfill situation. And these, again, all by 2050, but I will talk in a second about how these might be revised a little bit. So the city also has a number of leadership goals. Just to say that the city's putting its money where its mouth is, and that the goals for the City of Toronto as a corporation are reflective of the community's goals, but are a little bit more aggressive over the things that we have control over, like our buildings, for example, and our building operations. So you might remember in 2019 that the City of Toronto, along with 1,000 other, literally 1,000 other municipalities, declared a climate emergency. So in the fall of 2019, City Council directed our division to to report back on how we will now become a net zero city. So our original goal was to reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050. But then in 2019, with the climate emergency declaration, we were asked to report back to council on how we will reduce our emissions to net zero, so zero by 2050 or sooner. So that's a report which I'm going to talk about in a second, which is going to council in a couple weeks. It was delayed quite significantly by the pandemic, unfortunately due to staffing resources. A lot of our division in the beginning of the pandemic were actually redeployed to more emergency responses. I myself was redeployed for about 6 months working in the emergency operations center. So the report was delayed. Unfortunately, it was to go to council last year and how we will get to net zero, but it is going in a couple weeks. So where we're going and where we're at, you can see we're on the right trajectory in Toronto. We have reduced our emissions almost 40% since the 1990 levels. But we did see a bit of an increase here. You can see an increase from 2017 to 2018, where community-wide emissions actually increased about 7%. And that is due to primarily a colder winter season. So there was about 10% more natural gas burned in that winter, which contributed, you can see, which increased our emissions by 7%. So natural gas is quite a significant contributor. But we're on the right trajectory. So in terms of our progress to our targets, we need to have our emissions by 2030 or in the next 10 years to get to our 2030 targets. You'll note that these statistics seem a little bit out of date. So our most recent inventory, so it takes about 2.5 years to get the inventory for all of our emissions in Toronto together. So these are the 2018 inventory numbers. The 2019 inventory should be released imminently. In fact, I checked this morning and I was hoping to update all these numbers, although it's not a significant difference from 2018 to 2019. But 2018 is the most recent data that we have as of this moment. So we are looking at the necessity to reduce our emissions by half by 2030 to reach the targets that have been set by City Council, and that's all reflective in most municipalities globally. So that's significant. The 2030 target is quite an important number for us, which we're realizing now that I will show you in a couple seconds. The 2030 target is probably the most key target to ensure that if we reach that target, that we are on the right path to net zero. But you can see that we got a lot of work cut out for us, right? Like having our emissions in the next 10 years is quite significant. So just in terms, just to flag this really quickly, this is a question we get quite frequently is, as Toronto grows, how are our emissions being affected? And actually, we've seen in Toronto, again with the 2018 numbers, the same for 2019, that a decoupling between our city's growth and our economic growth and our emissions. So you can see the red and blue lines there, our population and our gross domestic product, and then our emissions in the green line actually going down. But our energy use does continue to go up, but still our emissions have decoupled from the growth and are reducing. Just going to check the chat to see if anyone has any questions. No, okay. Again, feel free to ask any questions that you'd like. I know I'm going very quickly and I'm showing a lot of boring graphs and slides, so let me know if you have any questions. And yet another graph. Hello, yay. Okay, so I talked a lot about net zero. So as I mentioned, in 2019, we were asked to report back to council on how we were going to get to net zero by 2050 or sooner. So what you can see here is where our 2030 target is. As I mentioned, how key that is in the trajectory to getting to a net zero city. If we reach that 2030 target, we are looking like we will reach net zero by 2050 or sooner, maybe 2040. and our report going to council will talk a lot about that in a couple of weeks. But you can see how much of a dip we need to get to get to 2030. So that's when I first started this city, I was like 2050 targets, that's so far away, or 2030. Will I even be working at the city then? But it is coming up like a freight train. So we really have a lot to do in the next 10 years to reach that target, to get us on that right pathway to become a net zero city. And you can see here what a definition of net zero is. It's a confusing term, but really it just means like what emissions that we're producing, we're offsetting. So really the city will be producing in the end zero emissions. All right, yay, question in the chat. What changes have been introduced in 2017 in building codes to decrease environmental impacts? Yeah, so that would be associated with the Toronto Green Standard, which is part of the city's efforts to reduce emissions and make more environmentally friendly buildings, and that's on top of the building code. So I actually don't know what changes have been made to the Ontario Building Code, but I can put a link in the chat to the changes that have made to the Toronto Green Standard, which have changed the levels of what is voluntary action to mandatory action, and that continues to grow. And actually one of the key actions for net zero is to continually increase the threshold of the Toronto Green Standard that's on top of the building code on a mandatory level. So while there's lots of buildings that have been doing it on a voluntary basis, which is amazing, but to really put in that regulation, so it is mandatory. I hope that answers your question. I will link in the chat as soon as I'm done speaking about the Toronto Green Standard. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you very much, Megan. Any questions of Megan?
Oh, sorry, I'm not quite done. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry. There's more boring to come. I'm sorry. I'm almost done though, I promise. So just some example actions, and within here is so near zero emissions from new construction and retrofitting existing buildings, Joe, that might be in your interest in the Toronto Green Standard. But you can see here that these are actions that the city has been an advocate for many, many, many years. But really what we need to do to get to our 2030 targets and to get to net zero is accelerate almost everything. So while we were saying, yeah, we'll slowly guide folks into electric vehicles, it has to be a very rapid uptake of electric vehicles, and we have to make sure that the grid is ready for that. So we know what to do, it just, everything needs to be accelerated in the next 10 years. So in terms of key challenges, I've talked all about these 10 years, but we do have limited time. So bold action is required now to get to our 2030 targets, to get to net zero. It's absolutely essential that we and municipalities and jurisdictions around the world are acting now, accelerating our actions that many have been undertaking for many years. I just want to highlight a little bit about jurisdiction and interdependencies. So the City of Toronto we can't do net zero alone. It requires a lot of cooperation between other levels of government. We also have a lot to do within the City of Toronto, where environment and energy can't just say, hey, we're doing this now. There's a lot of interdependencies within the building operations and building just general operations of the City of Toronto that we have to really work together as a corporation. And if you're familiar with the City of Toronto, we can be quite siloed. So there's a lot of cooperation that is needed within the City of Toronto, but then with other levels of government and with the residents of our city. There's a lot of inequity. I don't think this will come as a surprise to anyone, but Toronto's equity deserving residents are affected more significantly by climate change than others, also contributing less emissions. So there's a lot of inequities in climate change and climate action that we're needing to focus on in the next, well, forever, but then especially in the next 10 years. And then in terms of adoption of behavior change, as I mentioned, there is a lack of awareness about what to do for climate change, and requiring a lot of individual action, which can be challenging for folks if you don't know what to do, but then also perhaps there's a lot of barriers to action in people's individual lives. And then in terms of financial investment, as I mentioned, there will be some individual action that is required of residents, and there's a financial investment there. There's also a huge financial investment on behalf of the City of Toronto and other levels of government. While there is likely to be a net savings to both the City of Toronto as a corporation and to the residents of Toronto when we reach our net zero targets, there's a lot of upfront cost, and I'm sure it doesn't come as a surprise to anyone that is certainly a challenge. But there's lots of opportunities. As I mentioned, there's lots of co-benefits to climate action. You can see here some interdependencies and how we're making the city a better place in climate action. But like all the actions that we've proposed and that we continue to advocate for make the city a more equitable, prosperous, and healthy place. So as I mentioned, existing technologies is huge for us, that all the actions that are embedded within Transform TO and the net zero strategy to come are based on existing technologies. So we don't need to wait for anything. We're ready, we know what to do. We just need to really take bold action and get started, or continue, but accelerate. The labor market is a huge one for Toronto. Toronto's green industries is actually one of the fastest growing sectors of Toronto's economy, and that sector actually grows twice as fast as other sectors in Toronto. So seeing lots of opportunities in enhancing the labor market in Toronto to undertake actions to get us to net zero. As I mentioned, financial savings, swift action is likely to result in overall savings. So that's awesome. We just need to get everyone on board to perhaps do some financial investment at this point. And finally, civic engagement. So a big part of my role is talking all about climate action in Toronto. There's so many opportunities to get involved, which I'm going to talk about really quickly in a second. Yeah, it's really helping. Climate action is bringing a lot of communities together for the first time. So here's just like some examples of some city programs. I'm not going to go into these in depth. You can find them all on our website, but there's lots of programs that exist to support yourselves and your communities in financially or otherwise in undertaking climate action in your communities. We also have some specific support for community climate action. Again, this is a big part of my work. So working with folks where they're at in terms of wanting to do a project in their community. We have a team that's based just on community engagement, on environmental action. So if you have anything that you would like to do, please feel free to reach out to me. We're happy to provide project support or whatever it is a community agency or network might require to undertake climate action. That's what we're here for. And this is just a list of some individual actions. I'm sure not a surprise to any folks in this room, especially if you've heard me speak before, because it's kind of the same. But you can see those big buckets of emissions reflected here. So taking action on reducing your home energy, taking action on reducing greenhouse gases associated with your transportation, and reducing your waste. So whatever is going to landfill. So in terms of next steps, as I mentioned, the net zero strategy is going to the Infrastructure and Environment Committee on December 2nd. So gosh, 2 weeks from now. I would invite anyone who is interested in climate action to please consider deputing before committee. The agenda will be up next week, sorry, the 23rd. And I would welcome you to take a look at the agenda and the report and consider deputing if you are so inclined. We also have some formal programs working in climate action, our Live Green volunteers and our neighborhood climate action champions, if you're interested in being involved on an individual level. And then I mentioned we have all sorts of supports for community groups and community level actions. So we have grants, we have a stakeholder network. I would encourage you to take a peek at our website. It's called Let's Transform TO Together, to look at how we might be able to support you. If your club was interested in taking on any climate action projects, we're happy to support you in any way we can, but also on an individual level. If you and your household or your community or your neighborhood would like to take on climate action, we're happy to support you. And I just wanted to leave you with some smiling, happy faces, just to give you the sense that there is so much hope in Toronto. There are so many people doing so many amazing things for climate action. And this is what gives me joy every day working in this field, that so many people have a high level of concern for climate and are really taking on the banner of climate action in their communities. So this is just some examples of what happened over the pandemic when we couldn't gather together. So I just wanted to leave you with some nice happy faces, so you can see what folks have been up to. This is all from 2020. Oh, sorry, no, half of this year too. And that is it for me. I know I raced through very end at the end here, and I will take a peek at some questions here. How does the city navigate relationships on this issue with the province and the federal government? I carefully, for sure, strongly. We strongly advocate for cooperation between both levels of government. Part of the net zero strategy will talk a little bit about how to advocate to the province, especially for energy policy in Toronto, because that's not within our jurisdiction unless we're producing our own energy here. So yeah, a lot of my colleagues who work in policy are very closely connected with policymakers and implementers at the province and the federal level. It's super important. It's key. That's all I can say. Yeah, we can talk offline if you want. What kind of penalties will be imposed by regulatory agencies on specific industries to ensure these targets are met? I actually don't know the answer to that, because I don't know specifics about what regulations are required for actual like financial penalties. So yeah, I can get back to you, Lionel, if you wanted to shoot me an email. I can send you some details of what I know of that might exist already. But I am sorry, I don't know the answer to that one. And Neelam, oh, was there a delegate observer from the city at COP26? Not in person.
Thank you very much, Megan. Are there any other questions? Yeah, Chad?
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation, Megan. That's a good presentation. I mean, 2050 in EVs, I don't think is going to be super relevant. I think we're at a tipping point now, so it's not really a city thing, but the US will probably scoop up a lot of them first because looks like they're going to pass some subsidies, but very quickly thereafter, I think we're going to start to see them flood into Canada and Toronto as well. And so the first thing is really more of a comment. I would urge you to prepare for that, because the grid is going to be inundated with a new demand for power, and not necessarily during the day. The night is, that there's a lot of capacity now. I'm sure at first people with EVs won't sort of understand to charge at night, but you can probably incentivize them to do so. But then ultimately there's going to be a huge demand for energy. So I guess the question part of this would be, where is the new capacity coming from? Is it green capacity? Have you looked at batteries for sort of replace peaker plants? It's worked in a lot of other jurisdictions. It's actually cheaper. And the final part would be, are you allowed, I don't think you are, to sell energy back to the grid? And what's stopping us from being able to do that? Because it changes the economics for solar on the individual level if you can charge your car and send energy back to the grid in peak times. And then finally, more of a comment again is rates are so low, like why not just issue a massive green bond and make these upfront investments? They're going to have paybacks that our market is so hungry for yield. Like the paybacks are going to be way better in this than the I don't know what Toronto's paying on debt, probably 2 or 3% at most on long dated bonds.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, so I think I I think I've got, I can comment on most of things, but I'm by all means not an expert. In terms of capacity, you're absolutely right. As I mentioned, like if everyone went out and bought an electric vehicle right now, the grid could not sustain it at all. So working with Toronto Hydro and the province to ensure that there is that energy supply. And then to your other point, ensuring that energy storage is also available and makes sense for individuals, businesses, and for the city. So that is actually an action in the net zero strategy, which I'm not super familiar with energy storage. So that's really all I can say about it. But I can definitely send you some resources from the city and from the province on that. And sorry, I'm getting an emergency alert on my phone. I'm sure everyone else is too. Okay, sorry. In terms of selling energy back to the grid, I'm actually not sure if the city can do that or not. We don't produce a lot of energy now. We do produce a small amount. We don't produce a significant amount right now. But I would assume if we did, we'd be able to sell energy back to the grid. But again, I'm not too sure.
I don't believe you can. So like if I had a big house, which I don't, but if I did and I had a bunch of solar on my roof, it would cost me a bunch of money. I could buy some batteries, cost me some more money. And then I could charge my car for free forever, which is all well and good. But if I could sell the energy in my batteries back to the grid when there's a demand for energy, I could both help the grid, which is going to be more of an issue the more EVs there are, but also I could make a decent return on that as well. And that way, obviously, it's easier if individuals finance it than if you guys do. Although the other side of that is maybe you guys just should as well and build big battery storage, stationary storage to support the grid. The power is instantaneous and it's clean as opposed to, or it's as clean as where it comes from. It's either as clean as you're already producing, or it is solar energy on the individual level, as opposed to the peaker plants, which generally are dirty and you have no choice but to turn them on when there's a power shortage.
Absolutely. Sorry, I didn't realize you were asking about selling back to the grid on an individual level. My apologies, I was confused there. But in terms of our grid being clean, Ontario does have quite a clean electricity grid. A lot of our power comes from nuclear, which I know is a very contentious issue for folks. But generally, in terms of GHGs, we're talking about the electricity grid being quite clean as opposed with other jurisdictions. In terms of green bonds, I can pop a link into the chat. The city started issuing green bonds, I think 2 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. It has not been as frequent as some would like, for sure. But I'll get some info and pop it in the chat for you in a sec. Did that answer? I was frantically writing notes, so did I hit at least a little bit your points?
I think you did, Megan. I noticed there's another question on chat.
Oh,
a lot of people in Toronto live in condos. How can we advocate for condos to provide more sustainable waste management?
That is a great question. And actually, one of the biggest issues in the city of Toronto in terms of waste is multi-residential waste diversion. So meaning diverted away from landfill. We're seeing like very significant differences between single family homes and apartments or multi-residential buildings. So there's a couple things here to comment on. One is a big part of it is individual behavior change, unfortunately. So the city has some programs training and supporting residents in buildings and condos to educate their neighbors, talk to their neighbors about waste, but then also to advocate on another level outside of individual behavior change to property managers, condo boards, and how to properly support waste diversion. Often is an infrastructure issue in some of our aging multi-residential buildings, for sure. Like, who is going to walk down and bring their green bin and dump it somewhere rather than putting it down the chute? Like, I totally get that's a convenience thing. It's also sometimes it's gross. Like, nobody really wants to deal with their organics bin. Maybe the building doesn't even have City of Toronto pickup, so it doesn't have the ability to even like accept organics. so it's multi-level. So it's about the individual behavior change and helping to support that, but then also to helping to support the building owners, operators, and those who are making decisions on infrastructure in multi-residential. But you hit the nail on the head. That's a huge issue, huge.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
Question.
Yes,
Megan,
Andy?
I was surprised to see at the first of your slides that the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions was buildings. Except if you're going to change that, it's easy to say, well, change the building codes so that new buildings have to be more efficient. But old buildings and old houses cost a lot of money to change. Well, we just got some new windows or we're getting some new windows installed in our house. And when you do that, you have an energy assessment done for the federal government, I guess it is. But, and they give you some $150 a window back or something, which almost pays for the handle. But to significantly impact the greenhouse gas emissions from buildings is going to cost a lot of money. And where is the money going to come from? We fixed our windows not because of an energy efficient thing, but because they just wouldn't shut properly. They're old windows. And when we had the energy assessment done, they suggested all kinds of other things that we could do that would improve the efficiency of our house. Most of them would never be paid for in my lifetime or my kids' lifetime on a savings basis. So how are you going to convince people that they want to make changes to their house or to their condo building or whatever?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge for sure. So the financial investment on the individual level could be significant for home retrofitting for sure. Some of the things that the strategy talks about is like the financial incentives that government can provide, but then also the opportunities for the city and other levels of government in conjunction with local businesses and community groups to bulk buy materials, bulk retrofit, like this one-off retrofit. They're trying to reduce the cost by retrofitting a number of homes in the same neighborhood at the same time together. And then also like, so even like the energy assessment, for example, is a barrier for folks. Like if you choose not to implement any of those changes or any of the significant changes, like that's a big out of pocket if you're doing an energy assessment. So how do we work together with communities to like maybe an entire city, entire block, everyone gets an energy assessment at the same time, reducing those costs and reducing those barriers. Certainly though, like you're absolutely right, the financial investment could be huge. And it could be in a point where if you've just built your house, I don't want to renovate now. I just built this, you know. So trying to understand for folks when they're ready for a retrofit, capitalizing on that to do maybe a massive retrofit. But yeah, you're right. I don't have a silver bullet for that one, unfortunately. I wish I did.
Yeah. Thanks, Megan. Incidentally, our building at 121 King Street West is being totally recladded, and it's been going on for about the last 8 months, and it's still underway. If you have time for one more question, Megan, Joe Clark wonders about how the proposed construction of Highway 413 will improve the environmental impact of transportation.
Oh, you're breaking my heart, Joe. Why are we talking about that highway? Come on. Obviously, I'm not personally a proponent of new highways, and I don't know the exact GHG impacts that particular highway might be. I did read that there was a claim that it would reduce emissions because people would be stuck less in traffic. So I don't have. I'm sorry.
Maybe Megan, you can pitch that question to the province.
Okay, thank you very much, Meg. I don't see any other hands raised right now, so let me call on David to move a vote of thanks.
Megan, on behalf of the club, I'd just like to thank you formally thank you for giving us this presentation on the environment. and it's one of our newest, as the environment is one of our newest areas of focus, is of great importance to Rotary and to our club, as Neelam has pointed out. So I was surprised during your presentation to learn that a large portion of the people are aware of the impacts of climate change, but don't know what to do about it, which is really surprising. So education seems to be a real impact that you can bring forth, and hopefully the club can help with that. Transform TO seems to be a comprehensive strategy by the city and addresses both the gas emissions as well as the social and health benefits for the city, for the residents of the city, which is great.
Yeah, I'll come and get it.
Stephen, mute yourself, buddy. Getting to net zero emissions is an aggressive plan, and specifically to 2030, which seems really tough for me. But having said that, it's not that far off, and I hope that Rotary Toronto Eglinton, I'm sure Neelam's going to push on this, as well as Christina from our environmental committee, will hope to be a great partner for the city in regards to how we can address and help make this all happen. So on behalf of the club, I want to thank you again for taking your time today and really bringing some more information to us to help us further our impact on the environment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I will say my goodbyes, but I didn't forget about the chat. So I will put lots of links in the chat for your future exciting reading for later. But thank you again so much. It was a pleasure to see you all again and have this time. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan. Megan, if you wish to stay, you're welcome, but we're going to get into club business now. So if you wish to be excused, that would be fine.